Monitors blared a frantic rhythm as the decorated Marine commander violently shoved the medical tray, demanding a different nurse. He despised the civilian staff, roaring that she knew absolutely nothing of true sacrifice. Unfazed, she quietly rolled up her scrub sleeve, revealing a faded ink insignia that made his heart stop. Antiseptic and stale coffee. Those were the twin scents that greeted Morgan Bennett every morning at the Carl Vinson Veterans Affairs Medical Center. At 34, Morgan, known strictly as Cat to the exhausted staff of Ward 7C, was a senior trauma nurse whose reputation for unshakable calm was legendary. She did not coddle her patients, but she fought for them with a ferocity that intimidated even the attending physicians. On this particular morning, the ward vibrated with a distinct nervous energy. The source of the tension was in room 714, retired Marine Commander Marcus Sterling. Marcus Sterling was a ghost of the Desert Wars, a man whose military record was as heavily decorated as his physical body was scarred. At 62, he possessed a frame carved from granite, though it was currently diminished by severe osteomyelitis, a deep bone infection stemming from decades-old shrapnel wounds, and a heart condition that was rapidly deteriorating. He was also, by unanimous staff consensus, an absolute nightmare. "He just threw his morning oatmeal at the wall," Nurse Sheila whimpered at the nurse's station, dabbing a stain from her scrubs. She was trembling. "He told me my incompetence was more lethal than enemy fire. I can't go back in there, Dr. Harrison. I just can't." Dr. Harrison rubbed his temples, staring at the thick medical chart in his hands as if willing it to combust. "He needs his intravenous antibiotics, Sheila. If he misses another dose, the infection in his femur will enter his bloodstream. We are looking at sepsis by nightfall." "Then find someone else," Sheila shot back, her voice cracking. "He demanded someone with a spine. His exact words." Morgan stepped up to the counter, her expression unreadable. She reached out and pulled Marcus Sterling's chart from Dr. Harrison's hands. Her green eyes scanned the thick stack of papers, darting past the blood test results and focusing entirely on the demographic and history section. Her gaze froze on a single line of text under his military service record. Commanding Officer, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Sangin Province, Afghanistan, 2010. A subtle tightening of Morgan's jaw was the only indication that she had read anything of note. She closed the metal binder with a sharp clack. "Draw up the vancomycin and a fresh saline flush," Morgan said quietly. "I'll take him." Dr. Harrison sighed with palpable relief. "Be careful, Cat. He's completely uncooperative. He's in a tremendous amount of pain, but he refuses to admit it. And he's taking it out on anyone who walks through that door." "I've dealt with worse," Morgan replied, her voice flat. She prepared the medication tray with methodical precision. As she walked down the long linoleum-floored hallway, the sounds of the hospital faded into a low hum. She paused outside room 714. Through the small glass window, she could see Commander Sterling sitting upright in bed, his posture rigidly straight despite the visible sweat beading on his forehead. His silver hair was cropped in a strict military fade, and his pale blue eyes stared fiercely at the television, though it was turned off. His left forearm was heavily bandaged, and the remnants of Sheila's breakfast tray were scattered across the floor. Morgan pushed the door open. She did not knock. "I told that weeping willow of a nurse to send someone who actually knows how to follow a direct order," Marcus growled without turning his head. His voice was gravel and rusted iron. "Unless you have a medical degree and a functioning brain, turn around." "Good morning, Commander Sterling," Morgan said evenly, stepping over a spilled puddle of oatmeal. She set her tray down on the bedside table. "My name is Morgan. I'll be taking over your care. And for the record, the floor is for walking, not for your breakfast." Marcus finally turned to look at her. His eyes narrowed, sizing her up. He saw a woman of average height, her dark hair pulled back into a tight utilitarian bun. She wore no makeup, no jewelry, and her navy blue scrubs were pristine. "I don't need a babysitter, Morgan," he spat, leaning forward. "I need competent medical staff. I need to speak to the chief of medicine. I'm not letting another civilian pincushion my veins just because they watched a tutorial on the internet." "You have a raging bone infection, Commander," Morgan replied, snapping on a pair of purple nitrile gloves. "If you don't receive this vancomycin in the next 10 minutes, you will likely go into septic shock. The chief of medicine is currently in surgery, so you are stuck with me. Give me your right arm." Marcus's face flushed red with sudden fury. "Do you have any idea who you are talking to?" "I'm talking to a patient in room 714, Morgan said, holding her ground. She moved closer, picking up the tourniquet. "Get out," Marcus ordered, his voice dropping to a dangerous, terrifyingly calm register. Get someone else. Get a male nurse. Get a military doctor. I'm not letting some soft suburban civilian touch me. You people have no discipline. You know nothing about pain. Get out." Morgan stood motionless for a long second. She looked at the proud, broken man in front of her. She knew the anger was not really about the IV. It was about the loss of control. It was about a man who used to command hundreds of lethal warriors, now reduced to a hospital bed, battling a microscopic enemy he could not shoot. She placed the tourniquet back on the tray. "I'll give you exactly 1 hour to cool down, Commander. I will be back and you will take this medication." She turned on her heel and walked out, leaving Marcus glaring daggers at her retreating back. As the heavy wooden door clicked shut, Morgan leaned against the hallway wall and closed her eyes. Her mind flashed back to a deafening roar, the smell of burning diesel, and the blinding white sun of the Afghan desert. She forced the memory back into its dark box, took a deep breath, and walked toward the nurses' station. The real battle was just beginning. By afternoon, Marcus Sterling's condition had noticeably deteriorated. The infection in his leg was aggressive, surging through his compromised immune system. When Morgan returned to room 714 later that day, the air inside was thick and unnaturally warm. Marcus was thrashing slightly against the sterile white sheets. His skin was pale and slick with a feverish sweat. His breathing was shallow and rapid. Despite his obvious physical decline, the defiant fire in his pale blue eyes remained unextinguished. If anything, the fever had stripped away whatever thin layer of civility he possessed, leaving only raw, unfiltered combativeness. "I told you," Marcus rasped as Morgan entered, his chest heaving. "Get someone else. I demanded a different nurse. Did you not hear the order?" "The order was ignored," Morgan said, her tone professional, though her eyes carefully monitored the erratic spiking on his heart rate monitor. She wheeled an IV stand closer to his bed. "Your temperature is 103.4 degrees, Commander. You are running out of time. And quite frankly, so am I. We need to start a central line." "Nobody is putting a line in my chest," Marcus barked, attempting to sit up. Though the effort made him wince in agony, he clutched his bandaged leg. "You civilian pill pushers are all the same. Arrogant, entitled. You think because you work in a hospital you understand life and death? You don't know a damn thing." Morgan calmly prepared the sterile field, ignoring his outburst. She opened a package of betadine swabs. "Lie back down, Marcus. You're straining your heart." "Don't call me Marcus!" he roared, slamming his good fist against the mattress. The sudden movement knocked his water pitcher to the floor, shattering the plastic and sending ice water pooling across the linoleum. "You call me Commander. You haven't earned the right to use my name. None of you have. You sit here in your air-conditioned rooms complaining about long shifts while real men, better men than you will ever meet, bled out in the dirt." Morgan stopped. She held a betadine swab midair. "You want to talk about pain?" Marcus continued, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and deep, suppressed grief. Delirium was beginning to blur the lines between the present and the past. "You think a needle hurts? Try watching a 19-year-old kid holding his own intestines in his hands. Try writing a letter to a mother telling her that her son isn't coming home because a coward left an IED in a dirt road. You soft civilians, you don't know what it means to serve. You don't know what it means to hold the line." Marcus was panting now, his eyes wide and unfocused, staring at a ghost only he could see. "Private First Class Caleb Miller," he whispered hoarsely, tears finally breaching his stoic defenses. "Corporal Miles Wyatt, I ordered them down that alley. I ordered them. You think you know pressure, little girl? Get someone else. Get me someone who actually understands what it means to bleed." Silence descended on the room, broken only by the rhythmic, urgent beeping of the heart monitor. Morgan slowly lowered the betadine swab to the tray. She did not call for security. She did not run out to Dr. Harrison. Instead, she walked over to the door and locked it with a heavy click. She turned back to the room and walked to the window, pulling the privacy blinds completely shut. The room plunged into a soft, shadowy dimness. Marcus blinked, his combat instincts flaring despite his weakness. "What the hell are you doing?" Morgan walked to the foot of his bed. She reached up to her neck and unclipped her hospital ID badge, tossing it onto the bedside table. Then, with deliberate, unhurried movements, she grabbed the cuff of her left scrub sleeve. "You talk a lot about the dirt, Commander," Morgan said. Her voice was no longer the clinical, detached tone of a hospital nurse. It was low, gritty, and carried the heavy weight of authority. "You talk about the sand and the blood and the 19-year-old kids." She pushed the dark blue fabric up past her elbow, revealing her left forearm. You talk about Corporal Miles Wyatt. I remember Miles. He had a terrible habit of chewing on sunflower seeds and spitting the shells into the Humvee vents. He was missing his front left tooth because he tripped over a crate at Camp Pendleton. Marcus's breath hitched, his eyes widened. The feverish haze broke for a fraction of a second. How do you... Morgan stepped directly into the light of the overhead exam lamp. She rotated her left arm so the inner forearm faced Marcus. There, etched deeply into her skin, was a faded but intricate black tattoo. It was not a dainty civilian piece. It was a rugged, aggressively styled piece of military ink. At the center was the caduceus, the winged staff and serpents of the medical field, but intertwined with the staff was the eagle, globe, and anchor of the United States Marine Corps. Above the emblem, arched in bold Gothic lettering, were the words Fleet Marine Force, and below it, the undeniable specific numerals that made Marcus Sterling's blood run cold, 3/5 Darkhorse. I was there in Sangan, Morgan said, her eyes boring into his. I was a Navy hospital corpsman attached to your infantry unit. I spent 8 months eating the same dirt, breathing the same sand, and bleeding right alongside your boys. Marcus stared at the tattoo, his jaw trembling. He was entirely paralyzed. You want to talk about Private First Class Caleb Miller? Morgan asked, her voice cracking for the very first time, a tear slipping down her cheek. Caleb was my patient. When that IED went off in the alley, I was the one who crawled through the suppressive fire to get to him. I was the one who tied the tourniquets. I was the one whose hands were inside his chest trying to stop the bleeding while we waited for the medevac that took too long. She leaned over the bed, her face inches from his, the ghosts of the Afghan desert swirling between them in the sterile room. I was the last face Caleb Miller saw, Commander, Morgan whispered fiercely. I held his hand when he died, so do not ever tell me that I don't know what it means to serve. Do not ever tell me I don't know what it means to bleed. Marcus Sterling, the hardened, unyielding Marine commander who had terrified the entire hospital wing, slowly raised his trembling right hand. His fingers brushed against the air just inches from the ink on Morgan's arm, as if touching a holy relic. Doc! He choked out, the old Marine slang for a corpsman slipping from his lips, his voice breaking entirely. You're a doc? I was, Morgan said, gently rolling her sleeve back down, covering the scars and the ink. Now I'm your nurse, and right now, Commander, you are going to let me put this central line in your chest, or you are going to die. And I refuse to lose another man from the 3/5. Do we understand each other? Marcus stared into Morgan's eyes. The anger was gone. The defiance was gone. In its place was an overwhelming, crushing wave of brotherhood and relief. Slowly, the commander lay his head back against the pillow. He closed his eyes, a single tear escaping and tracking down his weathered face. Aye, Doc, he whispered. Do it. The heavy silence in room 714 was broken only by the sharp rip of sterile packaging and the rhythmic synthetic beep of the cardiac monitor. Morgan moved with the fluid, practiced efficiency of a combat medic operating under fire, though her current battlefield was a dimly lit VA hospital room. She prepped the insertion site just beneath Marcus's right collarbone, swabbing the skin with cold chlorhexidine. You're going to feel a sharp sting, Commander, followed by a lot of pressure, Morgan warned, her voice steady. She picked up the introducer needle. Do not move. Marcus Sterling did not flinch. He stared at the acoustic tiles on the ceiling, his jaw locked tight. As the needle pierced his skin and found the subclavian vein, his knuckles turned white, gripping the metal bed rails. But he remained as still as a stone statue. Within minutes, Morgan threaded the guide wire, dilated the tissue, and secured the central venous catheter, suturing it precisely into place. She connected the heavy dose of intravenous vancomycin. The life-saving antibiotic finally began its unobstructed path directly into his bloodstream. Procedure complete, Morgan murmured, stepping back to strip off her bloody gloves. She disposed of the sharps and wiped a sheen of sweat from her own forehead. The adrenaline that had spiked during their confrontation was beginning to recede, leaving a heavy emotional exhaustion in its wake. Thank you, Doc, Marcus said, his voice a raspy whisper. He sounded 10 years older than he had an hour ago, the fight entirely drained from him. Morgan pulled up a small, rolling stool and sat beside his bed, resting her elbows on her knees. The darkness of the room felt like a confessional booth. You were a terror to my nurses today, Marcus. I know, he admitted, turning his head slowly to look at her. The fever was still burning brightly in his pale blue eyes, but the delirium had retreated. I thought I was back in Helmand Province. The smell of the antiseptic, the beeping machines, it all started bleeding together, and then the pain hit my leg right where the shrapnel took the bone. Osteomyelitis doesn't care about your rank, Morgan said softly. It will kill you just as dead as a bullet if you don't let us treat it. Marcus let out a dry, humorless chuckle. Maybe it should have. For 12 years, Doc. 12 years I've been carrying the ghosts of 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. You were there. You know what Route 611 was like. We lost 25 men in that deployment, 200 wounded, the highest casualty rate of any unit in the war. Morgan looked down at her hands, the memory of the blood and the relentless heat washing over her. Darkhorse suffered. We all left pieces of ourselves in that valley. I ordered them down that alley in Sangan, Marcus said, his voice trembling as the deep festering wound of his guilt was finally laid bare. Private First Class Caleb Miller, Corporal Miles Wyatt, Specialist Ryan Doherty. It was supposed to be a routine flank to secure a market intersection. I reviewed the drone footage myself. I cleared the route. I gave the command over the radio. Moved to phase line yellow. Marcus closed his eyes tightly, a tear escaping into the wrinkles at the corner of his eye. 10 seconds later, the earth opened up, a pressure plate IED, and then the ambush, heavy machine gun fire from the rooftops. I sent them into a slaughterhouse, Cat. I have to live with that every single day. I see Miller's mother at his funeral in Arlington. I see her face every time I close my eyes. Morgan let him speak. She knew the crushing weight of survivor's guilt. It was an epidemic among their kind. She reached out, her hand gently resting over his uninjured forearm. Commander, Morgan said, her tone carrying a gentle but absolute authority, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Marcus opened his eyes, looking at her through a blur of tears. You did not send them into a slaughterhouse, Morgan stated firmly. You sent them to the right place at the exact right time. Marcus shook his head bitterly. Don't patronize me, Doc. The intel was flawed. The intel was perfectly accurate for a flanking maneuver, Morgan countered, leaning closer. But what you never read in the final after-action reports, because it was classified by battalion command until 3 years ago, was what Miller and Wyatt actually found in that alley. Marcus stopped breathing. He stared at her, the heart monitor picking up a slightly faster rhythm. What are you talking about? When I crawled into that alley to get to Caleb, Morgan explained, the memory playing like a vivid, terrifying movie behind her eyes. He wasn't just lying in the dirt from a random blast. His body was positioned in front of a heavy iron gate. Behind that gate was a courtyard, and inside that courtyard was a white Toyota Hilux packed floor to ceiling with artillery shells and homemade explosives. Marcus's eyes widened in absolute shock. It was a VBIED, Morgan continued, her voice thick with emotion. A vehicle-borne improvised explosive device. The insurgents were holding it in that alley, waiting for your main command element, your convoy, to roll past the market square. If that truck had pulled out into the street, it would have vaporized 3 Humvees. It would have killed 80 Marines. It would have killed you. Morgan squeezed his arm gently. Caleb Miller saw the truck. He saw the insurgents trying to open the gate. He and Wyatt didn't trigger a random IED. They actively engaged the gatekeepers. They threw a frag grenade to disable the truck, and the insurgents detonated a smaller defensive charge in panic. That's what killed them. They didn't die because of a bad order, Marcus. They died because they made a split-second decision to sacrifice themselves to stop that truck from reaching the main road. They died saving the rest of us. The silence that followed was absolute, deafening in its intensity. Marcus Sterling, a man forged in the fires of the most brutal combat of the modern era, began to weep. It was not the quiet, dignified tearing of an officer. It was a guttural, chest-heaving sob that tore through his ribs. 12 years of unrelenting, toxic guilt, the belief that his incompetence had murdered his boys, shattered into a million pieces on the linoleum floor of Ward 7C. Morgan stood up and did the only thing a corpsman could do. She wrapped her arms carefully around the commander's trembling shoulders, holding him as the fever broke and the ghosts of Sangan were finally allowed to rest. In the weeks that followed, the transformation on Ward 7C was nothing short of miraculous. The vancomycin, delivered effectively through the central line Morgan had placed, aggressively beat back the osteomyelitis. Marcus's fever vanished within 48 hours, and the color returned to his face. But the physical healing was secondary to the profound psychological shift in the commander. The terrifying, belligerent patient who had thrown oatmeal at Nurse Sheila was gone. In his place was a quiet, fiercely respectful veteran who followed every medical directive to the letter. He became the model patient of the VA hospital, but his absolute loyalty was reserved exclusively for Morgan. "Good morning, Dr. Harrison," Marcus boomed one morning as the attending physician walked in, flanked by medical residents. "You can skip the long speech. Doc Bennett already checked my vitals, flushed my line, and reviewed my white blood cell count. It's down to 9,000. I'm ready for oral antibiotics." Dr. Harrison blinked, looking at the chart and then at Morgan, who was standing quietly in the corner, a smirk playing on her lips. "Well, Commander, it seems Nurse Bennett is running my ward now." "She ran a triage unit under heavy mortar fire, Doctor," Marcus replied sharply, though there was a twinkle of humor in his eye. "I think she can handle a few clipboards. Treat her with the respect she has earned." "Always," Dr. Harrison smiled, shaking his head. "We are scheduling your discharge for this Friday, Marcus. You're very lucky." "I know exactly how lucky I am," Marcus said, his eyes finding Morgan's across the room. When Friday arrived, the autumn sun was streaming through the hospital windows, casting long golden shadows across the lobby. Morgan had just finished her morning rounds when she was called down to the main discharge desk by the head charge nurse. "They're waiting for you, Kat," the charge nurse whispered, pointing toward the heavy glass doors. Morgan frowned, walking around the counter. As she stepped into the center of the lobby, she stopped dead in her tracks. Waiting for her was Commander Marcus Sterling, sitting upright in a wheelchair, dressed sharply in civilian clothes with a dark blazer and a USMC veteran cover on his head. But he was not alone. Standing in a rigid, silent semicircle behind his wheelchair were 6 men. They wore a mix of civilian clothes and leather motorcycle cuts, but their bearing was unmistakable. Some had prosthetic limbs, some had visible burn scars. All of them carried the heavy, unmistakable aura of men who had seen the edge of the world. Morgan recognized them instantly. Her breath caught in her throat. There was former Staff Sergeant Marcus "Bulldog" Garner, leaning heavily on a cane. Next to him was Lance Corporal David Ramirez, whom Morgan had treated for a gunshot wound to the shoulder in the back of a shaking medevac helicopter. These were the surviving veterans of 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Darkhorse. As Morgan stepped forward, the bustling noise of the hospital lobby seemed to vanish. Patients, doctors, and nurses stopped what they were doing, sensing the gravity of the moment unfolding before them. Marcus unlocked the brakes on his wheelchair and pushed himself forward until he was only a few feet away from Morgan. He looked up at her, his pale blue eyes clear and full of an overwhelming, profound gratitude. "Doc," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet lobby. "For 12 years, we thought we left our guardian angel in the desert. We didn't know she was still here, still fighting, still saving lives." He reached into his blazer pocket and pulled out a small, worn wooden box. He held it out to her. Morgan's hands were trembling as she took the box. She unlatched the tiny brass clasp and opened the lid. Resting on a bed of faded velvet was not a medal nor a challenge coin. It was a pair of silver dog tags, heavily scratched and dull from the desert sand. The name stamped into the metal read, "Miller, Caleb J." "Caleb's mother gave those to me 5 years ago," Marcus said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "She told me to hold on to them until I found peace. I found it, Kat, because of you. You were the last one to hold him, and you are the one who brought him home to me. Those belong to you now." Tears streamed freely down Morgan's face. She clutched the dog tags tightly to her chest, the cool metal a stark contrast to the warmth flooding her heart. She looked up, making eye contact with every single Marine standing behind their commander. They were all weeping silently. "Attention!" Staff Sergeant Garner suddenly barked, the command ringing out like a gunshot in the hospital lobby. Instantly, the 6 Marines snapped their heels together. Even Marcus, pushing through the lingering pain in his leg, forced himself to stand up from his wheelchair. His posture was as straight and unyielding as a flagpole. In perfect, unified unison, the veterans of 3/5 Darkhorse raised their right hands in a crisp, deeply respectful salute. It was an officer and his men saluting an enlisted Navy corpsman. It was a breach of traditional military protocol, but it was the highest form of honor in the brotherhood of combat. They were not saluting her rank. They were saluting her soul. Morgan stood tall, the tears still falling, and raised her hand, returning the salute with the fierce, undeniable pride of a woman who had walked through hell and brought her brothers out the other side. The bonds forged in the darkest places on earth can never truly be broken. Morgan and Commander Sterling's story is a profound reminder that true heroes walk among us every day, often hiding their deepest scars underneath everyday uniforms. If this incredible story of sacrifice, healing, and brotherhood touched your heart, Please drop a like, share this video to honor our veterans, and subscribe for more gripping stories.